Hello again, everyone, and welcome to week four. And in week four, we're going to look at how to de escalate conflicts. Last week, we looked at escalations of conflict and some of the sources. This time, we look at seven and eight, which really talks about how do we de escalate conflict and then move to a point where we have resources to get us from um, escalating, de escalating, and then get us to mediation, which is we'll talk about in chapter 8. But real quickly here, chapter 7, de escalation on conflict. And it's important because we have probably seen wars, even today. There are wars that exist between countries that they might not be fighting, but the bitterness is still there. It might be within families or between father and a son, a mother and a daughter. The conflict is so pervasive. So it talks about a couple of processes for de-escalation. So this is on page 180, the social psychological process, which is talked about in chapter 6 when it talked about the cognitive dissident theory. And this is where a person's behavior doesn't match their attitude. It's me saying that I don't really like, you know, a particular setting or a particular subject or person, but then I am in that setting or around that person. So my behavior doesn't really match my attitude. That's the psychological process. It talks about other ways to de-escalate too. It talks about organizational processes, and a lot of organizations, companies, have processes for dealing with issues. It might be sick time. There might be some discretion for the manager of the organization to affirm or deny someone's sick time. But the company has processes for both the manager and the employee to follow. And maybe it says something like if it's for this type of an emergency, illness, a death in immediate family, or whatever it is, it's time. It's organizations that have been through this and developed processes to do it. Another one it talks about on page 185, and that's reciprocity in interaction. Reciprocal. This process opposes the three escalation pattern discussed in chapter 6, the logic, contentious interactions, and expansion of the issue at stake and polarization. So, what reciprocity in this means is that you give a little and I give a little. It's almost like compromising, right? So, how do I be reciprocal? You offer something, you might offer an apology, and then I'll apologize, even though I may not think that I was wrong. And then it talks about how do you develop ties between adversaries on 187. So it's not just de escalating, but how do we look at moving forward with something that's very positive? 189 talks about the changing conditions. De escalation, in large measure, occurs as a result of actual changes in the condition that underlie the emergence of the conflict that sustain the escalation. So it should be something, it could be something that happened over time. And it might be, for an example, I think they use a country here, but it could be a person that over time that said that this person felt that they talked too much and they were cutting me off or whatever. But over time, that person has receded and communicating, and maybe I don't feel like they cut me off as much. So just changes in conditions also causes de-escalation in the process. Um, it's policies and things that can be developed by a lot of companies that says this is how we're going to deal with it. The book talks about on 199, talks about low level escalation and said it's easier to stop conflicts from escalating destructively if the struggle had not been persisted for a long time and escalated greatly. That kind of makes sense, right? And that's why it's always recommended if there's an issue, two things. If there's an issue between you and I, Let's deal with it with you and I, and not spread it and bring other people in. And then secondly, deal with it quickly. Sometimes we might say in our human nature, well, I'll just let it go now. But and then you can act too quick too. So it's really knowing that it's a conflict, and it's also knowing that I need to deal with it quickly. Okay? It talked about the short-term protracted struggle on page 205 and long-term on 207. That's about it with there. And I want to move real quickly into chapter 8, and that's mediation conflict. We talked about this a while back, but there's different types of mediation and arbitration. When someone mediates, they are just like a neutral party. They're just trying to ensure that both sides are seeing the same things the way it's intended. Arbitration is completely different. That person has direct rule to make decisions, and they're generally binding decisions. Table 8.1 talks about the 3 types of mediation services. There's a person that provides resources, there's a person that manages the process, and then there's an advocacy for the process. So read through that, make sure you have a good understanding. It says here on 221, good definition of mediators and other intermediaries may act in many ways that they help lessen the hostile feelings and antagonize an interaction that hamper members of one side actively perceiving the other side of believing that the person is not trustworthy. So mediators see through that, and they help deal with that. For an example, I was counseling a couple that were having issues, and one of the things I noticed is that they would always point fingers at what the other was or was not doing according to their perception. So they had these standards of each other. So when I asked them to begin to communicating with each other with I need statements versus accusatory tone, so versus saying, well, you did this and you did that, put it in I need statements. And it's not I need statements where I need you to do this. No, it's I need you to be able to say, I pick up the kids on Tuesdays and Thursdays because I'm working late. It's those type of I needs. On page 222, it says mediation also includes making suggestions that help build mutual appreciation between the adversarial representatives. Totally true. And if you ever get into mediation, in fact, you can go to mediation school, and I don't know what they pay now, but it was like $500 a day back in the day. Pretty good business. It's important for the mediator, listen to this, to not only be neutral, but to be perceived as neutral by both parties. And that's kind of hard to do because they don't think that the mediator is neutral. Then how can they expect anything else to be neutral? So that's chapter 8. Please take a look at that, and we'll come back with week 5.